But on September 15, 1715, the drums of destiny shattered that silence. Once used to send kings into the afterlife and awaken forces beyond mortal reach, they thundered again, not for a crowned monarch, but for a man who never sat the throne. As 47 drums sounded across the Highlands, the land trembled, ancient spirits stirred, and the line between myth and memory disappeared. What did they awaken? And why now? Comment. Your theories. Like if you felt the tremor of the past, and subscribe to uncover what else Scotland's soul remembers. On September 15, 1715, a sound long thought lost to myth echoed once more through the Scottish Highlands, a sound last heard when kings were gods and death shook the heavens. The drums of destiny, ancient instruments tied to the soul of a nation, spoke again for the first time in 4 centuries, not just to mourn a man, but to awaken something long buried. What power did they unleash? And why was this forbidden ritual brought back for a king who never wore the crown? On the morning of September 15th in the year 1715, across the rolling hills of the Scottish Highlands, a sound began to echo that had not been heard for over 3 centuries. A sound so ancient and terrible that it seemed to rise from the very stones themselves, carrying with it the weight of forgotten rituals and the power to shake kingdoms to their foundations. It was the deep, resonant boom of the drums of destiny, the sacred instruments that had once announced the death of kings to a realm that stretched from the misty shores of the Outer Hebrides to the blood-soaked battlefields of the English border. The drums were not merely musical instruments, but artifacts of profound mystical significance, carved from the heartwood of ancient oak trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of Celtic dynasties. Their surfaces stretched with hide, taken from the last great aurochs, to roam the Highland glens. Each drum bore symbols older than Christianity, older than Rome. Symbols that spoke of a time when the death of a king was not simply a political event, but a cosmic catastrophe that required the intervention of forces beyond mortal understanding. The man who struck the first beat that September morning was Magnus MacLeod, the last of the royal drummers, a hereditary position that had passed from father to son through 47 generations, each drummer sworn to absolute secrecy about the rituals they performed and the knowledge they carried. Magnus was 73 years old, his hands gnarled with arthritis and his eyes clouded with cataracts. But when he raised the carved mallets that had been blessed by druids and bishops alike, his movements possessed the fluid grace of a man half his age, guided by instincts that had been bred into his very bones. The first drum spoke with a voice like thunder rolling across the mountains, its boom echoing off the granite cliffs and stone circles that dotted the Highland landscape like sentinels left by an ancient race. The sound was not music in any conventional sense, but something far more primal, a vibration that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the earth itself, in the stones and trees and streams that formed the living body of Scotland. Those who heard it felt their hearts skip a beat, felt their blood run cold with a recognition that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the deepest layers of ancestral memory. The second drum joined the first, with a rhythm that was both funeral march and war dance, its deeper tone weaving through the higher voice like a bass line in a symphony composed by powers that predated human civilization. Together, the two drums created a sound that was hypnotic and terrifying, beautiful and mournful, a musical representation of the great wheel of life and death that turns eternally at the heart of all existence. But these were not the only drums that would sound that day. For the death of James Francis Edward Stuart, the man who would be remembered by history as the Old Pretender, required the activation of the entire network of royal drums that had once linked every corner of the Scottish realm. From the Isle of Skye to the shores of Loch Lomond, from the ancient fortress of Stirling to the mist-shrouded valleys of Galloway, drummers who had waited their entire lives for this moment began to take up their mallets and add their voices to the growing chorus of lamentation. The story of these drums and their terrible purpose stretched back through the mists of time to an age when the line between legend and history was as thin as morning fog over a Highland loch. They had been created, according to the oldest songs and stories, by the first High King of the Scots, a man whose name had been lost to time, but whose legacy lived on in the instruments he had commissioned to announce his death to a kingdom that stretched beyond the boundaries of the physical world, into realms where the spirits of ancestors dwelt in eternal vigilance over their descendants. The drums were carved by master craftsmen who had studied their art not just in earthly workshops, but in the sacred groves where the old gods still held sway. Men who understood that they were creating not just instruments, but conduits through which the very essence of kingship could flow from one generation to the next. Each drum was unique, its carvings telling the story of the clan or region it represented, its voice calibrated to harmonize with all the others in a great symphony that could unite the scattered peoples of Scotland in shared grief and common purpose. The hide that covered each drum was taken from animals that had been ritually hunted and killed according to ceremonies that dated back to the time before memory, their spirits bound into the instruments so that their voices would carry the message of royal death across distances that would defeat mere human messengers. The mallets were carved from rowan wood and blessed with waters drawn from sacred springs, each one inscribed with runes that were said to give the drummer the power to speak directly to the souls of all who heard his call. For over 800 years, the drums of destiny had sounded only 7 times, each occasion marking the death of a king whose passing required the mobilization of mystical forces to ensure the proper transfer of power from the deceased monarch to his heir. The drums did not sound for every royal death, only for those kings whose connection to the ancient sources of Scottish sovereignty was so profound that their passing threatened to tear the very fabric of reality that held the kingdom together. The first recorded sounding had been in the year 843, when Kenneth MacAlpin, the first king of the Scots and Picts, lay dying in his fortress at Scone. The drums had beaten for 7 days and 7 nights, their rhythm growing slower and softer as the king's life ebbed away, until the final beat coincided exactly with his last breath. In that moment, witnesses reported, the very stones of Scone seemed to pulse with otherworldly light, and the ancient symbol of the kingship, the stone of destiny itself, was heard to sing with a voice like crystal bells touched by a gentle wind. The second sounding came in 1018, when Malcolm III died in battle against the Northumbrians, his death announced by drums that began to beat in perfect synchronization across the entire Scottish realm, despite the fact that no human messenger could have carried the news of his death so quickly. The third was in 1124 for David I, the fourth in 1165 for Malcolm IV, the fifth in 1214 for William the Lion, and the sixth in 1249 for Alexander II. Each time the drums had spoken with voices that seemed to come from beyond the boundaries of mortal existence, their message carrying not just news of death, but assurance that the sacred continuity of Scottish kingship remained unbroken. But the seventh sounding, which had taken place in 1286 upon the death of Alexander III, had been different from all the others, more urgent and desperate, filled with a note of warning that chilled the hearts of all who heard it. The drummers had beaten their instruments with an intensity that cracked the drumheads and split the wooden frames, as if they understood that they were announcing not just the death of a king, but the beginning of an age of darkness that would see Scotland torn apart by civil war and foreign invasion. That had been the last time the drums had sounded, for the wars of Scottish independence that followed Alexander's death had scattered the royal drummers to the winds, some killed in battle, others driven into exile, the rest forced to hide their sacred instruments in caves and ancient burial chambers, where they would remain silent for over 400 years. The knowledge of the drumming rituals was preserved only in the memories of a few families who passed the secrets from generation to generation, like precious heirlooms, waiting for the day when a true king would once again claim the Scottish throne and require their services. That day had seemed to come in 1688, when James VII was driven from his throne by the forces of William of Orange, creating a crisis of legitimacy that split the Scottish nation between those who accepted the new Protestant monarchy and those who remained loyal to the ancient Catholic line of the Stuarts. James Francis Edward Stuart, born in that year of revolution and upheaval, had grown to manhood believing himself to be the rightful king of Scotland, the heir to a throne that had been stolen from his family by foreign usurpers who understood nothing of the mystical bonds that connected the Scottish crown to the land and people it governed. For 27 years, James had lived in exile in France, gathering supporters and planning the restoration that would return him to his ancestral throne. He had studied the ancient histories of Scottish kingship, had learned the secret rituals and sacred obligations that bound a true king to his realm, had prepared himself for the day when he would cross the North Sea and reclaim his birthright with sword and banner and the blessing of all who remained faithful to the old ways. But as Magnus MacLeod struck the royal drums that September morning, he was not announcing the death of a king who had reigned in glory and died in honor, but the passing of a man whose dreams of restoration had died with him in the cold corridors of a foreign palace, far from the Highland moors and island shores that had called to him in his sleep for nearly 3 decades. James Francis Edward Stuart had died in Rome in the Palazzo Muti, surrounded by loyal courtiers who had shared his exile but not his vision, attended by priests who offered the consolations of religion but could not heal the wound in his heart that had been torn by the loss of a kingdom he had never truly possessed. His death had been quiet and unremarkable, the kind of ending that comes to many men who outlive their ambitions and find themselves stranded in a world that has moved beyond their understanding. But to Magnus MacLeod and the other royal drummers, who had maintained their vigil through decades of silence, James remained the rightful king, the anointed heir of an unbroken line that stretched back through the mists of prehistory to the first men who had dared to call themselves rulers of the Scottish realm. His death, therefore, required the full ceremonial response that had been reserved for true kings since time immemorial, regardless of whether he had ever worn a crown or sat upon a throne or commanded armies in his own name. The drumming began at dawn and continued through the morning, each beat precisely timed according to rituals that had been refined over centuries of practice. The rhythm was not random, but followed ancient patterns that told the story of Scottish kingship through sound alone, beginning with the triumphant marches that celebrated the founding of the kingdom and gradually shifting to the mournful dirges that mourned its passing. As the sun climbed higher in the September sky, the sound of the drums began to carry across the Highland landscape with an intensity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Shepherds tending their flocks on distant mountainsides heard the booming rhythm and knew without being told that something momentous had occurred. Fishermen casting their nets in remote lochs felt the vibrations through the water and saw their catch swim toward the shore as if drawn by the ancient call. In the great houses of the Highland clans, elderly men and women who had not heard the royal drums in their lifetimes nevertheless recognized the sound from stories passed down through generations of oral tradition. They rose from their beds and their chairs, some of them weeping without understanding why, all of them feeling the pull of something that spoke to the deepest levels of their Scottish identity. The drums were not merely announcing a death, but performing a ritual of such profound significance that it touched every person of Scottish blood, regardless of their political allegiances or religious beliefs. The sound carried within it the accumulated weight of over 1,000 years of Scottish history, the voices of every king who had ruled justly and every hero who had died for the freedom of their homeland. But there were those who heard the drums with terror rather than reverence, for they understood that the ancient ritual was not just a ceremonial farewell to a dead pretender, but a calling forth of forces that had been dormant for centuries. The drums were awakening something that had slept in the stone circles and burial chambers of Scotland since the last true king had died, something that cared nothing for the political realities of the 18th century and recognized only the eternal laws that governed the relationship between a rightful king and his sacred realm. In Edinburgh Castle, the officers of the Hanoverian garrison felt their hands shake as they tried to write dispatches to London, the rhythm of the distant drums interfering with their ability to think clearly or express themselves in coherent sentences. In the drawing rooms of Edinburgh society, ladies fainted and gentlemen reached for their swords without conscious thought, all of them feeling the pull of ancestral memories that their rational minds insisted could not be real. The Presbyterian ministers, who had spent decades preaching against the superstitions of the past, found themselves unable to conduct services, their voices drowned out by the supernatural drumming that seemed to emanate from the very walls of their churches. The sound was not loud in any conventional sense, but it possessed a quality that made it impossible to ignore, a penetrating resonance that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. As the day wore on, the pattern of the drumming began to change, becoming more complex and urgent as additional drummers joined the ritual from their hidden positions throughout the Highlands. Each new voice added layers of meaning to the growing symphony, creating harmonies and counter-rhythms that would have been impossible for human musicians to coordinate without years of rehearsal. But the royal drummers were not working from written music or following the direction of any earthly conductor. They were guided by instincts that had been passed down through bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of Scottish civilization. their timing synchronized by forces that operated beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The most powerful moment came as the sun reached its zenith, when all 47 of the surviving royal drums spoke together for the first time in over 4 centuries. The sound that rose from the Highland glens in that moment was unlike anything that had ever been heard by mortal ears, a harmony so perfect and terrible that it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of reality itself. In that instant, witnesses throughout Scotland reported seeing visions that defied rational explanation. Above the mountains, ghostly figures appeared in the clouds, the spirits of ancient kings riding across the sky in phantom processions that stretched from horizon to horizon. In the lochs, the water began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence, and shapes moved beneath the surface that were too large and too purposeful to be any known creature. The stone circles that dotted the Scottish landscape began to hum with sympathetic vibration, their ancient stones resonating in harmony with the drums until the very earth seemed to be singing. In the burial chambers of forgotten kings, lights appeared that had not been seen since the time of the Druids, illuminating carvings and symbols that told stories older than any written history. But perhaps the most remarkable phenomenon occurred at Stirling Castle, where the ancient coronation stone of the Scottish kings had been hidden for safekeeping during the wars that followed the Jacobite uprisings. As the drumming reached its climax, the stone began to move of its own accord, rising from its resting place and floating in mid-air while surrounded by a corona of blue-white light that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of the distant drums. The supernatural display lasted for exactly 1 hour, from noon until 1 o'clock, before gradually fading as the drumming began to slow and soften. The royal drummers were following a pattern that had been established over a millennium earlier, a ritual sequence that represented the journey of a king's soul from earthly life through death and into whatever realm awaited beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the drums entered the final phase of their ancient ceremony, a series of soft, measured beats that grew progressively quieter until they were barely audible even to those who stood within a few yards of the instruments. This was the moment of release, when the soul of the dead king was committed to the care of his ancestors, and the responsibility for the continuing welfare of the Scottish people was passed to whatever powers would accept the sacred trust. The final beat came as the sun touched the western horizon, a single resonant boom that seemed to echo through every valley and glen in Scotland before fading into a silence that was deeper and more profound than mere absence of sound. In that silence, those who had witnessed the day's events felt a change in the very air around them, as if some fundamental aspect of reality had been altered by the ritual they had experienced. Magnus MacLeod set down his mallets with hands that trembled from exhaustion and age, knowing that he had performed the last duty required of his ancient lineage. The royal drums would not sound again, for James Francis Edward Stuart had been the last man with any legitimate claim to represent the mystical kingship that the drums were designed to serve. With his death, an age that had begun in the mists of prehistoric Scotland had finally come to an end. But the effects of that final drumming would resonate through Scottish culture for generations to come, inspiring poets and musicians, historians and mystics, all of whom tried to capture in words or music the indescribable experience of hearing the voice of ancient Scotland speaking across the centuries. The drums themselves were quietly buried in secret locations throughout the Highlands, their exact positions known only to a few trusted guardians who swore that the instruments would remain hidden until Scotland once again had need of the mystical forces they could summon. In the years that followed that supernatural September day, strange tales began to emerge from every corner of Scotland, stories that spoke of the lingering effects of the royal drums and the mystical forces they had awakened. Travellers crossing the Highlands at twilight reported hearing faint echoes of drum beats carried on the evening wind, rhythms that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. Shepherds spoke of nights when their flocks would gather in perfect circles, as if responding to commands that only they could hear, their eyes reflecting a light that came from no earthly source. The stone circles that had resonated with the drums on that fateful day continued to exhibit strange properties long after the last beat had faded into silence. Farmers ploughing fields near these ancient monuments found their oxen refusing to work, the animals standing motionless with their heads raised toward the standing stones, as if listening to voices that human ears could not detect. Children playing near the circles spoke of seeing figures in ancient robes moving among the stones, figures that vanished the moment adult eyes turned toward them. In the libraries and archives of Edinburgh and Glasgow, scholars began to notice peculiar changes in the ancient manuscripts that recorded the history of Scottish kingship. Words that had been illegible for centuries suddenly became clear, as if the drumming had somehow restored the faded ink and clarified the obscured meanings. New passages appeared in texts that had been studied for generations, passages that told of prophecies and promises that had been waiting for the proper moment to reveal themselves to mortal eyes. The most dramatic changes occurred in the Highland clans themselves, where the blood of ancient kings still flowed through the veins of men and women who had long forgotten their royal heritage. In the weeks following the drumming, these descendants began to experience vivid dreams that transported them back through centuries of Scottish history, allowing them to witness the great moments of their ancestors' lives with startling clarity and detail. Clan MacLeod, to which Magnus the royal drummer belonged, found themselves the keepers of knowledge that had been lost for generations. The elderly members of the clan began to remember songs and stories that had never been written down, epic tales of heroism and sacrifice that had been preserved only in the deepest layers of ancestral memory. These stories spoke of a Scotland that existed not just in the physical realm, but in a parallel dimension where the spirits of the ancient kings continued to rule over a kingdom of legend and dream. The musical traditions of Scotland also began to change in subtle but profound ways. Pipers found their instruments producing notes that had never been heard before, haunting melodies that seemed to emerge from the pipes without conscious effort on the part of the musicians. These new tunes spread throughout the Highlands with supernatural speed, each clan adding their own variations while maintaining the essential structure that connected all the versions to a common source. The Church of Scotland struggled to understand and respond to these supernatural manifestations, with some ministers declaring them to be evidence of divine intervention, while others condemned them as manifestations of pagan superstition. But even the most skeptical clerics could not deny the profound impact that the drumming had produced on their congregations, many of whom reported experiencing spiritual revelations that transformed their understanding of their faith and their relationship to the land of their birth. Among the Jacobite sympathizers who had remained loyal to the Stuart cause, the drumming was interpreted as a sign that their struggle was not yet over, that the death of James Francis Edward Stuart marked not the end of their hopes, but the beginning of a new phase in the eternal battle for Scottish independence. Secret meetings were held in remote Highland glens, where the echoes of the drums had been strongest, gatherings where men and women pledged themselves to causes that transcended the political realities of their time. The effects of the drumming extended beyond Scotland itself, reaching the Scottish communities that had been established in Ireland, North America, and other distant lands. Letters began to arrive from Scottish emigrants, reporting strange dreams and supernatural experiences that had occurred on the very day that the drums had sounded, despite the fact that these colonists had no way of knowing what was happening in their homeland. These shared experiences created a sense of mystical connection that bound the scattered Scottish diaspora together in ways that mere political or cultural ties could never achieve. In the universities of Europe, scholars who specialized in the study of ancient cultures and prehistoric religions began to take notice of the Scottish drumming and its aftermath. They recognized in these events evidence of survival mechanisms that allowed ancient wisdom to persist through centuries of suppression and neglect, emerging at moments of crisis to remind later generations of truths that had been thought lost forever. The French court, where James Francis Edward Stuart had spent his final years, also experienced strange phenomena in the days following his death. Courtiers reported seeing apparitions in the halls of Versailles, ghostly figures dressed in Highland garb who appeared briefly before vanishing like morning mist. The room where James had died was found to contain traces of heather and Highland flowers, despite the fact that no such plants grew anywhere near the palace. Even in Rome, where the old pretender had breathed his last, mysterious events unfolded that seemed connected to the Scottish drumming. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica began to ring in patterns that resembled the rhythms described by witnesses to the Highland ritual, and pilgrims visiting the Vatican reported hearing what sounded like distant bagpipes echoing through the ancient corridors of the papal palace. As months passed into years, the memory of the drumming became woven into the fabric of Scottish folklore, inspiring countless ballads and legends that preserved the essential truth of what had occurred while embellishing the details with elements drawn from the collective imagination of a people who understood that they had witnessed something far more significant than a mere funeral ceremony. The caves and hidden chambers where the royal drums had been buried became sites of pilgrimage for those who sought to connect with the ancient sources of Scottish spiritual power. Though the exact locations of these burial sites remained known only to a few trusted guardians, the general areas attracted visitors who came seeking healing, inspiration, or simply a deeper understanding of their Scottish heritage. Children born in the years following the drumming exhibited unusual gifts and talents that their elders attributed to the mystical energies that had been released by the ancient ritual. Some of these children displayed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and natural disasters, while others seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the Gaelic language, even when raised in households where English was the primary tongue. The wildlife of the Scottish Highlands also showed lasting effects from the drumming experience. Deer were observed gathering in formations that mirrored the patterns of ancient Celtic symbols, and eagles circled the sites of the stone circles with a frequency and precision that suggested they were responding to forces that remained invisible to human perception. The seasonal cycles of Scotland itself seemed to have been subtly altered by the drumming, with many observers noting that the transitions between winter and spring, summer and autumn had taken on a more dramatic and ceremonial character. The northern lights, rarely seen so far south, began to appear with greater frequency over the Scottish Highlands, creating displays of ethereal beauty that reminded viewers of the supernatural phenomena that had accompanied the drumming. Magnus MacLeod, the last royal drummer, did not live long after completing his final duty, but the 3 days between the drumming and his death were marked by visitations from figures that only he could see. Family members reported that he spent hours engaged in animated conversations with invisible companions, speaking in languages that predated written history and gesturing toward empty air as if welcoming old friends to his bedside. When Magnus finally passed away, his death was accompanied by phenomena that echoed the supernatural events of the drumming ceremony. The drumsticks that he had used to perform the ritual were found to have become petrified, transformed into stone artifacts that seemed to glow with their own inner light. His hands, which had been gnarled and arthritic for years, were discovered to be smooth and youthful in appearance, as if the act of performing the ancient ritual had restored him to the condition he had possessed in his prime. The knowledge that Magnus had carried with him to his grave was not entirely lost, for in the final hours of his life he had managed to pass on fragments of the ancient wisdom to his youngest grandson, a boy of 12, who possessed the sensitivity necessary to receive and preserve such sacred information. This child would grow to become a keeper of Highland traditions, ensuring that at least some portion of the royal drummer's legacy would survive into future generations. The cottage where Magnus had lived became a shrine of sorts, visited by those who sought to understand the mysteries that surrounded the royal drums and their final ceremony. The walls of the humble dwelling seemed to retain echoes of the ancient rhythms, and visitors often reported hearing faint drum beats when they stood quietly in the room where the old drummer had spent his final years, preparing for the moment that would define his entire existence. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the memory of the drumming began to influence the broader cultural movements that were reshaping Scottish society. The Romantic movement found in the tale of the royal drums perfect material for the kind of sublime and mysterious narratives that captured the imagination of readers throughout Europe and beyond. Poets like Robert Burns drew inspiration from the legends surrounding the drums, creating verses that preserved the essential spirit of the ancient ritual while making it accessible to audiences who might otherwise have dismissed such stories as mere superstition. These literary works ensured that the memory of the drumming would persist even as the original witnesses passed away and the direct connections to the events grew weaker. The Highland clearances that devastated Scottish communities in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were seen by many as a consequence of the mystical forces that had been unleashed by the final drumming. The displacement of ancient clans from lands they had occupied for centuries was interpreted as evidence that the old bonds between the Scottish people and their ancestral territories had been irrevocably severed by the death of the last legitimate king. Yet even as the traditional Highland way of life faced destruction, the spiritual legacy of the royal drums continued to provide strength and inspiration to those who refused to surrender their cultural identity. In the ships that carried Scottish emigrants to new lands across the ocean, in the settlement communities that recreated Highland traditions in foreign environments, in the hearts of men and women who carried the memory of Scotland wherever their journeys might lead them, the echo of the ancient drumming continued to sound. The drums of destiny didn't just mark the death of James Francis Edward Stuart. They summoned the spirit of a forgotten Scotland where legend and legacy still hold sway. In their final thunderous voice was a nation's soul speaking across centuries of struggle and survival, of loss and renewal, of dreams deferred but never truly abandoned. And in their silence, a haunting promise that Scotland's spirit endures, waiting for the moment when the ancient rhythms might once again call forth the mystical forces that bind a people to their sacred homeland, and to the eternal truths that define their deepest identity. When James Francis Edward Stuart died, they could have let history forget him. Instead, they awakened something older than crowns and deeper than blood. The drums of destiny didn't just mourn a man, they reconnected a nation to its ancient heartbeat. And though the echoes faded, the promise lingers in stone, soil, and story. What legacy do you hear in the silence? Comment below, like if the rhythm still stirs you, and subscribe to keep the old voices alive.